Sure.
Okay. Good afternoon here. Good morning in other places. We are very happy to initiate today this new webinar series under the title Test Invited Papers Webinars, promoted by TEST, an official journal of the Spanish Society of Statistics and Operations Research, acronym SEIU, published by Springer since 1992. Formerly was Trabajos de Estadística since 1950, so it's about 24 years now. First, we thank SEIU for providing full support to the organization and diffusion of this webinar. As you well know, the journal Test has a consolidated and well-recognized international reputation for diffusion of high-quality research in statistics and probability, covering, in a broad sense, theoretical and methodological contributions in this area, with applications in perspective. The journal is indexed in particular by Clarivate Analytics Web of Science, with an impact factor rank position currently above the median in quartile Q2 in the category Statistics and Probability. This is a usual range of fluctuation of the journal. In some of the 4 issues published within each year volume, Test includes an invited paper with discussions by outstanding researchers in selected frontier topics. From now on, the authors and discussants will be invited to give a webinar on their recently published contribution, which we think represents an excellent opportunity for extra diffusion, direct interaction, and further potential exchange with the interested audience. In fact, all the webinar sessions will be recorded and will remain available in the SEIU YouTube channel. Today, we have an exceptional speaker, expert on an interesting paradigmatic topic, as well as 3 discussants, also experts in the field. And now I leave my colleague and co-editor-in-chief, Ana Maria Aguilera, with the presentation and moderation of the session. So thank you and welcome.
Okay, thank you, José Miguel. It is also a great pleasure for me to be here today organizing this seminar on the test invited paper, shape-based functional data analysis, co-authored by Professor Anuj Srivastava and his collaborators, Professor Wu and Huang from the Florida State University. I would like to thank again them for writing this piece of very interesting and motivating paper on functional data analysis. So we are going to begin by introducing Professor Anuj Srivastava, who is the speaker of this seminar. Professor Anuj Srivastava is professor in the Department of Statistics and a distinguished research professor at the Florida State University. He obtained his PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. After being a postdoc at Brown University for 1 year, he joined the faculty of Florida State University in 1997. His research interests include statistical analysis on nonlinear manifolds, statistical computer vision, functional data analysis, and shape analysis. He has held several visiting positions at European universities, including Rennes and Lille University in France and Durham University in the UK. He has co-authored more than 350 papers in peer-reviewed journals, top-tier conferences, and several books, including in the Springer Tepus on functional and shape data analysis. He is a fellow of several institutions in statistics, as ANS and ASA in electrical engineering, AEE, and computer science. He has developed an intense editorial activity, serving as an associate editor for highly prestigious journals such as the Journal of Statistical Planning and Inference, Sankhya, some journals of IEE, as Transactions on Signal Processing, Transactions on Pattern Analysis and Machine Intelligence, Transactions on Image Processing, etc. So I apologize for not being very exhaustive in the introductions, but time is limited, and both the invited speaker and also the discussants of this seminar are highly relevant researchers with extraordinary curricula. So we could spend the whole afternoon introducing them. So I give the word to Professor Anuj Srivastava. Please, thank you. Anuj, you have the word.
Thank you very much. Firstly, I want to thank Anna and José for inviting me to write that paper. It was a great experience, and I'm really happy that I got that opportunity. And then as a follow-up to be able to give this seminar. So thank you again. Thank you very much. I also want to thank the three discussants for participating. I look forward to their comments and a good discussion. All right. So for the audience, my name is Anuj Srivastava. And despite the fact that I live in Florida, my name, the J in my name is not silent. It's actually Anuj. But everybody says without the silent J, I'm used to it. So today's talk is about functional data analysis, a particular branch of functional data analysis. So let's get into it. So I want to start with the discussion on a more general framework, functional data analysis. For those who are not familiar with it, what is it? It's a field of statistics where data is in form of functions. The data objects that we deal with are functions of different kind. It's a very popular field. It's fastly growing in influence in statistics because of the prevalence of functional data in many domains, many scientific domains, especially modern data. A lot of modern data comes in form of images, and one can view them, images and videos, as functions. There are several applications fields that I'm involved in, and I will try to give some examples of where such data is useful. If you look at the current state of the art in FDA literature, this work, this FDA, is based on a certain mathematical foundation. And this mathematical platform is often based on a Hilbert space structure provided by the L2 metric. So here I've just tied down the Hilbert inner product and the norm, the L2 norm that provides this Hilbert space structure. I mentioned it's a popular field. There are a number of brilliant textbooks that have been written on it, and there is a lot of encouraging literature coming up. But most of it relies on this choice of L2 metric and this mathematical platform to build functional data analysis. There is a slightly different field, mostly disassociated with the previous slide. This is called shape data analysis, and historically evolved in UK with pioneering efforts of David Kendall, Ulf Grenander, and Professor Ian Dryden, who is actually present here today. So in this field, the concern is to compare shapes of objects, and the objects are often represented by a discrete set of points. They're called landmarks. And the interesting part about shape analysis is that we are not interested in the whole object. There are certain aspects of the object that we're interested in, certain aspects we are not interested in. So we remove the things that we are not interested in. And that leads to nonlinear geometry, and the strength and the achievements of this work is that they demonstrated how to use nonlinear geometry for statistical analysis. The limitation, of course, of this work is that one restricts themselves to some set of points. And so our effort is to bring these two distinct fields together. So on one hand, we have shape analysis, which is historically based on discrete finite sets of points. On the other hand, we have functional data analysis, which is associated with continuous objects, functions, curves, surfaces, and so on. And so we want to do functional and shape data analysis, but for more continuous objects such as curves and surfaces. There is also an overarching field, object-oriented data analysis, pioneered by Professor Steve Maron, who is present here, and hopefully we'll hear about it from him. And of course, Professor Ian Dryden has also contributed significantly. So getting back to shape-based functional data analysis, the topic of this paper. So the focus here is on functions, scalar functions, like these pictures. These are pictures from COVID studies of COVID rates over time. So these are real valued functions, but the focus is not on full functions, but rather the shapes of functions. So that brings the question, how are the shapes defined? Shapes are often related to number of peaks and valleys of functions, and I'm going to make that precise. But the challenge that this focus on shapes brings up is nonlinear representation. Just like the previous work on shape analysis, that if we focus on shape analysis of functions or curves, we have to require tools from differential geometry. Okay. I want to give a couple of motivational slides on why one needs to focus on shapes. Why can't we just go about doing functional data analysis as people have done previously in so many different textbooks? So here are some examples to motivate it. So the question is, how good is the L2 metric in comparing functions? So in the left picture, you see three functions in three different colors, blue, red, and magenta. And what I've done is simply compared the L2 metric between the first function, which is this magenta. The first is the red. So the red and the magenta, and red and the blue. It turns out in this example, the L2 distance between the red and the blue is more than the distance between red and magenta. And that's somewhat surprising. And that's the mathematical foundation on which the past FDA is built up. This distance is quite unintuitive, just visually looking at these pictures. And of course, the issue is that there is a phase shift between the red and the blue. We want the red and blue to look similar. We want them to come out similar, at least similar more than when compared to this magenta curve. But because of the phase shift, there is a large distance introduced in the process. Even small misalignments of peaks and valleys can introduce large distance. So what is the solution to this problem? The solution is, instead of comparing the functions themselves, we should compare their shapes. Another example here is when we compute statistical summaries, we do covariance analysis, we do factorization, and so on and so forth. We can run into some unintuitive results. So on the left, we have some examples. I have some bimodal functions. Each function has two peaks, somewhat color-coded. It's not so easy to see. But the issue is that the peaks are not aligned. They are placed at different locations. And if I compute their average under the L2 norm, I'm getting a curve which is drawn in black, which has many peaks. So the average of several bimodal curves has a peak, which has several nodes. This is somewhat simulated data to exaggerate a certain effect. But on the right is real data. This is COVID data where there were peaks associated with waves of different versions of coronavirus. And if we just average the data again, we get here some very shallow peaks. And we lose, due to this averaging, we lose the structure. So this is another motivation for not focusing directly on the functions, but rather on the shapes of the functions. In shape analysis of function, there is a very important tool which I want to just introduce at the outset. It's called time warp. Time warping is taking the domain of a function. So on the right, you see a function, maybe let's say a function in blue. And if you take the domain, which is the interval 0, 1, and time warp it diffeomorphically, so this diffeomorphism is shown on the left in the blue curve. So we non-linearly warp the domain of this function, we get a curve in the red. And the difference between the blue and the red is the points are shifted horizontally. Each value in blue is preserved. There is no movement vertically. All the values are preserved, but they are just shifted horizontally, but in a nonlinear fashion. And also the ordering is preserved. We are not switching the peaks and valleys. We keep the ordering of points. And so this is a very structured warping of the function. All right. So how is this useful in defining the shapes? So in this picture, you see a curve. And when we want to talk about shapes of this curve, we can keep some things, keep some idea, keep some properties, and discard some properties. So if we keep the heights and the numbers of peaks and valleys, but don't care about their location, that's one notion of shape. I'm calling it definition 1. In definition 1, we keep the peaks and valleys and their ordering, but we discard their placements. That means we allow the time warping to move these locations horizontally. So a descriptor for the shape of this function would be simply the heights x1, x2, x3, and the plus minus signs which talk about the peaks and valleys. So in this definition, any function and its time warping have the same shape. So for example, these two functions on the right have exactly the same shape because one is a time warping of the other. There's also another definition of shape where one can even discard the heights and simply keep how many peaks are there in a curve. So that's a little bit more of an abstract notion. Sometimes that is very handy. That's not what we are pursuing in this paper. In this paper, we are looking mostly at the first definition where any two functions that are within the time warping of each other have the same shape. So how does one compare the shapes of functions? To do that, we have to introduce this concept of registration via time warping. So on the top, I show comparison of two functions under the L2 metric. So I have two functions, f1 and f2. If I'm comparing them under this metric, what I'm doing is for every f1 of t, it is being compared with f2 of the same t. So in other words, the registration is always vertical. We are comparing the two functions, the points on the functions exactly at the same time. Now, shape-based functional data analysis allows us to be a little bit more flexible. It allows two points on one curve to match with another point on a curve, which is not necessarily vertical. And the way it does it is, it finds a time warping of a function. Let's say if I want to compare f1 and f2, I have time warping of the second function f2, this blue curve is time warped into this purple curve in a way that the peaks and valleys and the structures of f1 and the time warped f2 are aligned as well as possible. So here the registration is between f1 of t and f2 of gamma of t, where gamma is time warping. And so gamma is in our control. Okay. So that's the difference between the classical FDA and shape-based FDA, is we allow the registration to be more flexible. One of the advantages of using this flexibility is, for example, interpolation. So if I use two functions, f1 and f2, and if I interpolate between them using the L2-based interpolation, I get a sequence of functions where one peak is destroyed and another peak is created. But if I use a good registration, more flexible registration, as I described in the previous slide, a sequence of interpolations could be like this, which preserve the structure much better. And so this is the idea behind shape-based functional data analysis. Of course, then the question comes, how? How are we going to do the time warping? Somebody gives us these two functions. I have these two functions, f1 and f2. How do I find a gamma in such a way that the peaks and valleys are aligned as well as possible. Now I can say that in words, but how to do it mathematically was a big question. There's almost 10, 12, 15 years worth of publications in statistics which try to address this problem. And what they try to do mostly is they started with trying to minimize the L2 norm between F1 and the time warp version of F2. They very quickly found out that this problem is degenerate. You cannot use that. So they did what statisticians mostly do is we put penalties. If we run into trouble, we start introducing penalties. But it turns out there was a more fundamental mathematical problem which could not be handled, which could not be recovered via penalties. And the problem was this, that if I take two functions and calculate the L2 norm, and I time warp by the same time warping, both the functions by the same time warping, the norm can be drastically changed. It turned out to be a very fundamental problem. So the question was, how can one fix this? It turns out there are some metrics, a family of metrics. One of them is called a Fisher-Rao metric, which has this nice invariant property. So for this audience, I just want to give a very quick introduction to, of course, this is a literature in itself. What is Fisher-Rao? So Fisher and Rao, of course, the two great stalwarts of statistics, mostly parametric statistics. So they designed this metric, which is called the Fisher-Rao information metric. It's often used even in introductory mathematical statistics to define things like Cramér-Rao bound for putting the bounds on estimation errors. So this is a very well-known form even to an introductory grad class. But this is for a parametric version of Fisher-Rao. It turns out there is a non-parametric version of Fisher-Rao, which is very similar. You can see the parallels between the top equation and the next equation. It's this non-parametric Fisher-Rao which is what we are going to use. And in fact, in the hindsight, it's very surprising that it didn't get traction in the statistics community, because it turns out the use of parametric geometry, which is often in a field called information geometry, is much more complex. A non-parametric version is relatively easier and therefore much more usable. So we are going to use this non-parametric Fisher-Rao. It has some complications for use in functional data analysis directly. And so we ran into this issue. We were trying to use this for shape analysis, how to compare shapes of curves using this metric. It has nice mathematical properties, but it was computationally expensive. I was working with an engineering group, and someone there told us we need to do 1 million calculations a minute. So how are we going to do this? So it turns out there is a nice transformation, which is square root based. You take the square root of a function, take the absolute value, pull the sign out, and take the square root. What it does in a mathematical jargon, it converts this complicated non-parametric Fisher-Rao metric into this L2 metric. So here is another way of saying it. If I want to calculate the Fisher-Rao distance between two functions, I'm going to calculate their SRVFs, and I'm simply going to compute the L2 norm between them. Something that was quite complicated for many years, for a long time. And in fact, a lot of people gave up on using Fisher-Rao metric. It turned out that the solution is something as simple as that. It's simply an L2 norm after the transformation. So the whole machinery that we have developed over the decades on using the classical Hilbert structure using L2 norm can be just directly useful. Okay, and it has all the nice mathematical properties. So here is where back to my original problem. How are we going to do this registration? So I am given two functions, f1 and f2. I'm going to compute their SRVFs, q f1 and q of f2, and simply solve this registration problem without any penalties, without any human intervention, and it leads to a great registration. There are several examples of it, several properties that follow. Firstly, it is perfectly symmetric. Whether you register A to B or B to A, it gives you the same result. It also turns out that the minimization, the minimum value, is actually a proper metric, satisfies a triangle inequality. on a certain space. So one can actually do statistics using this, not just simply use it as a tool, but actually it provides a full mathematical framework. So we have started using it. It's actually a long time, maybe around almost 10 years ago. We worked on it first. So here on the left, I have a number of functions, and I am aligning them using this optimization problem. Here are some of the very original studies we did, in fact, in collaboration with Professor Steve Maron. The input to the code is the set of functions, and output of the code is align functions and the time warping functions that go into aligning. We, I think, originally called it phase amplitude separation. I'm calling it phase shape separation. There are packages, student of mine, Derek Tucker, who has developed packages one can install and directly use it for functional data analysis. People have given very good feedback about this package. What I want to do is take some examples of this basic mathematical framework. Now, what can one, as a statistician, what can one do in it? So I want to talk about, one can do shape estimation from the data, one can talk about regression models, hypothesis testing, comparing populations, generating models, longitudinal data. So anything that one does in statistics using functional data can now, one can now do it using shape-based functional data. All right, so the first problem I want to talk about is shape estimation. So looking at these curves, pictures on the left, in each case, there are two different examples, real data and assimilated data. We are given a number of functions, and our goal is to come up with what is an average behavior of these functions. What is a mean? Okay. What is a representative curve that represents these collection of curves? If we just take average without alignment, which is the L2 alignment, we get these pictures in the middle. If we take pictures with alignment, we get pictures on the right. And sometimes we can even do over alignment. And that's what we are seeing in these particular examples, that we get these results which are based on alignment, but sometimes over alignment. And so there is a notion of penalized. I referred to penalization earlier. One can actually do penalizations here also. And in the bottom, you see, in fact, I'll start from the bottom right, where I take average of the functions without any alignment. So it shallows out all the peaks and valleys. Then as we move left, we increase we reduce the penalty, and we do more and more elastic alignment, more and more flexibility in the alignment. So what happens is sometimes even the noise gets aligned, and you start seeing it as a peak. So the question is, how much alignment should one do, which is in mathematical terms, what should be lambda? And so we have developed a topological idea. I won't have time to explain it in great detail. I'll just do it pictorially. In simple words, the idea is, as we change lambda, we study the peaks and valleys of the average curve, and we form these things called peak persistence diagrams. How are the peaks persisting as we change lambda? And we select the lambda to be the one that allows the most persistent peaks to survive. So as we change lambda, the peaks appear and disappear. And so based on this peak persistence diagram, we have this selection of lambda. So I'll just mention one example. So this is again a COVID data on the left. One just does a simple L2 averaging, non-elastic, non-alignment averaging. Then we do a fully elastic averaging. And then we, based on the persistence diagram, we do a penalize. We select the optimal penalty. And then in the bottom right, you see this green curve, which is an estimator of penalized mean. I do want to mention in passing, there is another literature that we are developing, which is shape constrained estimation. Historically, there's been some work in estimation of density functions with some shape constraints, which actually goes back to my mentor, Wolf Prenander, in 1960s. He wrote one of the earliest papers on shape constrained density estimation. But what we are trying to do is something more general. That literature is often restricted to shape estimation with unimodality constraint or some simple shape constraint. What we are saying is you give us any shape. You say, I have this data and I want to estimate a curve with 6 modes, or even 6 modes in which few modes are taller than others. And we can impose that constraint and we can do that estimation. So it's much more flexible in that sense. Another thing I will mention in passing is regression models. There is a large literature on function regression model using functions, but now we are going to replace functions with the shapes of the functions. So sometimes we are interested in shapes of functions as predictors. So I just want to mention 8 mathematical models. Surely I don't have time to explain it, but we take one of the classical functional linear regression models and insert in it, instead of the standard L2 metric, we use a Fisher-Rao metric to make it invariant to the time warping of the function in such a way that the response y truly depends only on the shape of the predictor and not on its mark. And we have done some work. We have applied it to some examples, very nice COVID studies, where we looked at the COVID curves and tried to predict fatalities, for example, based on the treatment curves, based on the infection rates curves, how to predict these fatalities. Quite successful in doing it. In the last couple of slides, I just want to mention that so far we looked at only shapes of scalar functions. But of course, functional data is much larger field. And in fact, the beauty of functional data analysis goes really beyond scalar functions. Not only curves in 2D, 3D, but the surface three-dimensional objects, one can view it as functions. And in fact, even curves with branching structures, curves with graph structures. So just to show you examples that we have been able to study shapes of curves. There is an example of comparing shapes of planar curves. Here we have a number of planar curves and we are computing their mean and their principal components. So some sort of basic statistical summaries. Here we had a very nice problem, biological problem, where we had curves that came from mitochondrial boundary. And we were studying the fact that we had 2 populations, and are these 2 populations distinct? Can we distinguish? And it related to muscle tissue of mice who were exercising and muscle tissue of mice who were not exercising. And it was a very satisfying result to show that exercising mice have statistically different shapes of the mitochondrial boundary. So the exercise helps us at a macro level in our body, but it also helps at a cellular level in our boundary. So that was important. We have studied 3-dimensional objects. We can compute averages of human shapes. We have some, in fact, I'll mention this one, a longitudinal study. So we study parts of human brain for a long time. And we can talk about what is the average anatomical growth of a human shape, let's say a hippocampus, averaged over thousands and thousands of subjects taken across many different databases. We have also studied even more complex branching structures. This all, of course, requires explaining mathematically how this all comes together. But at the heart of it is still that same old square root function and the basic elastic shape analysis that I mentioned earlier. So I'm going to skip this because I'm running out of time. But as you can see, there is a lot more to the story than just so the final message I have for the audience is functional data analysis, of course, is an important field, but shape is an important consideration for functional data. I think it's very natural, it's very important. Of course, the challenge is to get into tools from geometry. I think statisticians face this issue that how to actually get started in this field. But nowadays, there are a lot of packages and computational solutions that are available that you can use and at least get started. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you very much for
Okay. Thank you, Professor Srivastava, for this nice presentation. Now we are going to proceed with the discussion of the paper. In the published version of the paper in the issue of March, the paper have 5 discussants by Professor Marron, Professor Ian Dryden, Professor Delicado, and also who are here today, and also Professor Sonja Greven and Professor Lajos Horvath, who are not able to be here for personal problems. So we thanks all of them for their comment and discussion. And we are going to begin with Professor Steve Marron. Are you ready? Okay. The presentation is okay. It's right. Professor James Stephen Marron is professor at the Department of Biostatistics and Amos Howry Distinguished Professor at the Department of Statistics and Operations Research in University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Professor Marron is widely recognized as a world research leader in the statistical discipline of high-dimensional, functional, and object-oriented data analysis, as well as data visualization. He has made both major contributions ranging from the invention of innovative new statistical methods through software development and onto statistical and mathematical theory. As a result, he is the co-author of more than 250 papers in high-impact journals. His research is developed in collaboration with colleagues in computer science, genetics, medicine, mathematics, and biology. A special strength is his strong record of mentoring graduate students, postdoc, and junior faculty in both statistics and also related disciplinary fields. Thank you, Steve, Professor Marron, for accepting our proposal to write this comment, and the word is yours.
Well, thanks very much for the kind introduction. This discussion will be joint with my student, Elise Borgert. I don't seem to be able to make the slides advance here. Am I missing something?
So, Steve, on the screen, if you put your cursor on your slide, there are left-right arrows on this window.
Got it. Okay, now it's become full screen. How do I make slides advance?
Now you in the middle, the right, bottom right was something that made it full screen.
Something happened there. Okay, anyway, so I'd like to say congratulations on a breakthrough paper. What I really like about this paper is it's taken a field I like to call curve registration, and it's really reoriented it in a whole new way. It's a whole new way of thinking about this by focusing on the context of shapes. Now, for me, I wonder if we should call these curve shapes. We'll have a discussion. I think I'll be hearing more about that. And I find the key contribution to be the formal definition here. I'm not seeing how to advance the slides. There we go. Thanks very much for the plug of the book on object-oriented data analysis by Ian and I. I'd like to point out at this point that the math gets pretty heavy here. A lot of statisticians aren't so well trained in that. And we worked hard on chapter 9 as a gentle introduction to this set of ideas. Can somebody advance that? Okay, great. So what's object-oriented data analysis about? Well, everybody understands big data is really a big challenge. Less well understood is that complex data may be an even bigger challenge. Object-oriented data analysis is about complex data. Next slide. So here's my favorite introduction to object-oriented data analysis, but basically it's about tackling things, including curves. For me, the name functional data analysis should be used for curves. I differ from Anuj here in that when you go to more general objects such as shapes, graphs, trees, movies, things like that. I think it makes more sense to call this object-oriented data analysis. Next slide. So what's the object-oriented data analysis here? Well, the key idea is this nice idea of taking shapes as data objects, and I really like the clever new object representation here, is how I would term that. Yeah, now a very important concept in object-oriented data analysis is modes of variation. I think this should be focused on more than it currently is, and the general definition I find to be a set of one-dimensional elements of object space that give insight into variation. So a canonical example for me are functional PCA. In the paper, they use the word directions. I admit I used to use that term myself. Directions make sense when your data objects that you're using as a mode of variation lie along a line or a geodesic. But there are cases where you want non-geodesic modes of variation, and that's why I suggest replacing directions by modes of variation. Next slide. There's interesting open problems here. I think one is when you do things like PCA on the warps, they can easily leave the space of warps. This is a toy example illustrating that. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but it's a set of warps on the left, and on the right you're seeing the first principal component mode of variation. Notice some of those actually leave the space of warps. Next slide. Here's a set of data I'm not going to try to put in time on, but it's human movement data. It's force over time as people are walking. And the ideas presented in this paper I found to be very important. In particular, the plots on the left, most are bimodal, but some are unimodal, some have more than one modal. So I really like this notion of shape, and especially shape at scale. Okay, so if you can go back just one slide. Yeah, and so one strategy to avoid this problem is the regularization. Now here's something I wanted to change. Anuj called this penalized. So in fact, that penalized approach is really valuable and helpful, and we found it here with this data. That's one way to avoid leaving the space of warps. Next slide. Another approach, which we should probably think more about maybe in the discussion, is in the previous analysis I did the PCA on the warps, one could do it in the square root velocity space. And I have to admit that's an open problem. I don't know exactly how much impact that will have. Next slide. But the approach I like the best, I must say, is these square root velocity functions live on the positive orthon of a high-dimensional sphere. There exist effective methods for finding modes of variation on that. Principal nested spheres you can see discussed in the object-oriented data analysis book. There's another approach called principal orthon analysis, which is currently being developed in the context of simplex analysis. Due to time, I won't go further with that. Okay, so once again, I'd just like to say congratulations on a breakthrough paper, and I'll stop here.
Okay, are you finished? Yes, yes, okay. Professor Anuj Srivastava, do you want to give a very brief answer to Professor
Yes,
Maron's comments?
thank you very much, Steve. Steve surely has. I mean, there are important contributions he has, but I've always valued Steve's opinion from like a bird's eye view of the field. I think that's important as we look at individual problems and to see like big picture of where we are going. So thank you very much, Steve, for all your support, past, present, and future. And your ideas are important, especially the involvement of the spherical geometry in analyzing the warping functions. And surely that's a field that is under-discovered and under-studied. You should surely look into it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to introduce Professor Pedro Delicado. Professor Pedro Delicado is professor at the Department of Statistics and Operation Research at Universitat Politècnica de Catalunya in Spain. He has over 30 years of research experience in statistics, with notable results published in the form of more than 50 articles in highly reputable journals. His research topics include unsupervised learning, principal curves, clustering, multidimensional scaling, and functional data analysis, spatial dependence, principal components. He has over 30 years of, I have said before, research experience, and he is also noted for his leadership in managing funded projects, as well as his multidisciplinary collaborations with other areas and prominent collaborators in statistics. Thank you, Pedro, Professor Delicado, for writing this nice comment on this invited paper. The word is yours.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you, José Miguel and Ana, for inviting me to participate in the discussion of this paper. The authors of this invited paper propose a non-standard way to perform functional data analysis based on the shape of a function. Among the most remarkable contribution of the paper, from my point of view, is the formal definition of the shape of a function, the definition of a square root velocity function, and its use to describe the shape of a function, to align set of functions, and also to define the shape distance between two functions. And I will focus on this last point because the definition of the shape metric opens different possibilities to perform shape-based functional data analysis, among them distance-based dimensionality reduction and distance-based regression. Okay, as you know, multidimensional scaling is a family of dimensionality reduction methods based on an interindividual distance matrix, capital D. The goal of multidimensional scaling is to find a low-dimensional configuration that is a matrix with as many rows as individual, in a way such that the Euclidean distances between two rows of this matrix is approximately equal to the corresponding entry in the original interindividual distance, capital D. In the last decades has been appeared extensions of multidimensional scaling in order to be able to reduce the dimensionality when we have nonlinearities in our data sets. This is what is called also manifold learning. Among the techniques belonging to this field, we can mention local multidimensional scaling, isomap, or T-stochastic neighborhood embedding. I will present an example of functions, of a functional data set at which I will apply these manifold learning techniques. I simulate 51 bimodal functions in a similar way as the authors do in the paper. I start from a three-dimensional normal with a very high correlation between components. So in this way, we can say that the underlying distribution is essentially one-dimensional. I have transformed this data in a nonlinear way, and then I can use the transforming results, is R1, R2A, to define functional data that has this bimodal shape. Here you have an example of this kind of functional data analysis. So I have applied to this data set, I have used the function time warping from the R package FDA SRBF in order to compute the square root velocity function, QI, and to align the functions and also to compute the shape distances. I have applied different dimensionality reduction methods to two different distance matrices. The first one, D2, is the L2 distance between the square root velocity functions of the original functions before alignment. And the second one is the shape distance matrix, that is the L2 distance between the square root velocity function after having aligned the data in an optimal way. So you can see here the results when I apply these dimensionality reduction techniques to the first matrix, to D2. In the first row, you have the original first principal components based on the correlation function of the three-dimensional normal data I have started simulating. So this is the golden truth. And you can see that the multidimensional scaling, the standard one, is not able to recover in a monotonic way this first principal component. But the nonlinear dimensionality reduction methods, local multidimensional scaling, isomap, and TSNE, are able to find a monotonic relationship with this hidden first principal component. On the other hand, if we apply these dimensionality reduction techniques to all to the distance shape matrix, we can see that even multidimensional scaling, that is in principle a nonlinear method, is able to recover the first principal component of the correlation matrix. This is because in the alignment procedure, we remove nonlinearities in our functional data set. So it is also worth to say that multidimensional scaling over this shape distance matrix coincides with vertical PCA, that is one of the dimensionality reduction techniques presented in the paper. Okay, so here you have the correlation, but it's more or less what I have tell before. So we can say that when we compute shapes of function and we compute distances from shapes, we are eliminating nonlinearities in our data set, and we can do a much better functional data analysis that with the original function. So this is something that we can learn from this example. Moving to shape distance-based regression, it is worth to say that in the last years of the 20th century, Carlos Cuadras and co-authors introduced distance-based linear regression model. That is a kind of algebraic formulas for doing prediction just from a distance matrix, doing the prediction that we would obtain if we perform multidimensional scaling and we use the principal coordinates and regressors. Some contributors later have extended this distance-based linear model to non-parametric versions and also to generalized linear model and generalized non-parametric models. There is a package implementing this method that is called DBStat, and I will show you the results of applying shape distance-based regression using the shape distance matrix when we have the previous bimodal functional data as the set of regressors. The response has been generated as computing the range of the functions and adding a Gaussian noise in order to have a signal to ratio quotient about 85%. So here you have the representation of the relationship between this scalar response and the first principal component obtained from the correlation matrix of this original three-dimensional multivariate normal. So we can see that there is a relationship, but it's a nonlinear relationship. So if we compute the distance-based linear regression using just the original proposal of Cuadras and co-authors, we have a very low R-square. We have a poor quality, and this is because the relationship with underlying distribution is a nonlinear relationship. But if we apply the local distance-based regression, that is local linear regression, is a non-parametric version of the previous one, we obtain an R-square that is 80%, 87%, that is very close to the 85%, which one we have simulated the data. So to finish my discussion, I will say that it is also possible to introduce the distance between phase functions, just computing this distance between phase functions just using the L2 norm, and then combining the distance between shapes and the distance between phases in a one unique distance matrix, and then we can perform distance-based scalar and function regression using this combination of distances. And I finish my contribution here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Pedro, for this nice presentation. Professor Srivastava, do you want to make some comments on the presentation of Professor Delicado?
Yes, thank you very much, Pedro. You've done a lot of work in functional data analysis, and I've followed your work over the years, and especially these are interesting things. Function dimension reduction, is a very fundamental problem, and we will probably be doing this for next several generations. But to have a different metric, somewhat more, natural for certain kind of data analysis goes a long way. And your example shows the importance of using the correct metric. So thank you very much for that. My interest lies in shape regression as well, using regression models using shapes of functions. But using this metric was something new for me, and I did read your discussion paper rather with great interest. So it's your example very clearly explains, and I suspect it will be very natural to use in a lot of real application data, real data, to develop regression models that use these such shape metrics directly, or even a combination of shape and phase metrics. So thank you very much for sharing that, and I definitely look forward to discussing more with you, especially on the regression models. I think there is a very long way to go. We are just getting started. Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you.
Thank you, Anuj. Now is the turn of Professor Ian Dryden. He is a professor at the Department of Mathematics and Statistics in Florida International University, with also a lot of years of research experience. And his main area of research is the development of statistical methodology in highly structured data analysis, including shapes, images, and functional data. He obtained his PhD from the University of Leeds, and he has carried out research at many other universities, as, for example, the University of Nottingham, University of South Carolina, University of Leeds, and University of Chicago. He has published about 150 articles in high-impact journals and a joint book with Kanti Mardia on statistical shape analysis. He is an elected fellow of the Institute of Mathematical Statistics, and he has also developed many funded projects related to his research, in addition to giving numerous lectures around the world. Professor Ian Dryden, the word is yours. Thank you for accepting also to comment on this nice paper.
Thanks very much indeed, and thanks very much for the opportunity to comment on this excellent paper. I'd like to congratulate Anuj and the authors for this really detailed exposition of the bringing together of the functional data analysis and the shape analysis. I think it's really great to have all this in one place with all the strong geometric and mathematical foundations, and also always good computational implementation. I think that's so important that other people are able to take your methods and use them for themselves, as we've seen already today. It really helps enormously. Just want to make a couple of points, really. The first is about the balance between phase variability and shape variability. You mentioned in your talk just now a nice way of choosing the penalty parameter. If we add the penalty parameter where you have lambda times some r function, which is a warping penalty, then topological data analysis is one way of doing it, but there may be other ways depending on the context. And is there overlapping on sounds? Shall I carry on? Okay, so one example is where we were looking at ground displacement of peat, which goes up and down. And the key thing is that when you're warping the functions, every year you have up and down annual cycle. So you don't want to be warping the functions more than really half a year. That's the maximum you want to warp. So in the work that we did, we experimented with the penalty and came up with a natural value that worked in that application, but that might not be appropriate in other applications. So I think this is going back to what Steve was saying about the object-oriented data analysis. It's very important to know what the data objects are in your application and to be able to gear your analysis so that it actually works there rather than in general. So here is the actual data that we had, and using the SRVF method, we were able to classify areas of peat as to good quality peat and dry peat and poor peat, but it worked well. So the next point I wanted to make is to do with the modeling. So you've got it in the paper. Anuj makes the case for modeling in the quotient space. So you have a manifold that you're interested in, and you have a group action that you want to remove, and the quotient space is what remains when you get rid of the group action. So the warping is the group action, and the manifold might be the function or a shape of a function. So another approach is to actually, rather than just removing by optimization, to actually model the group action. So you might model the phase variability. It has its own distribution together with the shape of the function, and you then will have some sort of joint distribution rather than just removing the phase variability. So one idea is to do sort of a Bayesian approach where rather than just optimizing, you model that as well, and that ties in with this penalty that we have seen that I was talking about just now. So it's just like putting a log prior term, adding that to the actual log likelihood. So if we then look at this in practice, it does tend to be fairly similar in many applications, although it won't be exactly the same because obviously, it depends what parameter lambda you put in. So finally then, in the paper, there are some really interesting research challenges at the end for analyzing like shapes of curves on manifolds. There are lots of really convincing approaches and useful insights. And I think it's clear, we've had sort of 15 years of SRVF, and it's really, being used in so many wonderful applications, but it's clear it's going to continue to be at the heart of solutions for many more problems in the future. So well done on this paper. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Professor Dryden. Anu, do you want to give an answer?
Yes, thank you very much, Ian. As we all know, Ian is Mr. Statistical Shape Analysis. I think we have learned a lot from him over the decades. He's a pioneer in bringing sort of nonlinear domains into statistical world and actually deriving theorems and applications. One thing that I feel like we have to emulate him in the sense that we are providing new mathematical foundations, but a lot of statistical analysis is still to be done in this sort of more general shape domains. As Professor Maron said, that data is getting more complex. People who provide us data, they are not making our lives any simpler. They are giving us more data and they are making it more complex. So what Ian and his colleagues have done in sort of classical traditional Kendall shape analysis is exactly the path we have to take in these more complex domains. And so the specific point he makes in his discussion about Bayesian versus optimization. Clearly, this is a sort of long-standing debate, and clearly Bayesian provides distinct advantages. For example, given two functions, as Steve showed Some functions may have two modes and some function may have only one mode. And so there might be multiple solutions that exist, and Bayesian approaches can discover multiple solutions, the whole landscape of registration, rather than just a solution as we currently have. So certainly that's a superior approach to go, but as more computational tools come about, as more clever implementations come about, I think that's the path we'll take. Thanks you very much, Ian. Enjoyed collaborations with you, and certainly you have paved the way for us to go forward on this. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, now we have finished with the discussant, but if other participants have questions, they can post them in the chat, and I will read them for Professor Srivastava. Meanwhile, I think that my colleague, Professor José Miguel Angulo, wanted to make some comments on the presentation of Professor Srivastava. So?
Okay, thanks. Can you hear well? I had a problem before with the sound. Okay, so well, this is a very interesting review and innovative contribution connecting functional data analysis and shape analysis. As a reader, I very much appreciate the flow in the paper from conceptual aspects to formalization to method, as well as the critical discussions in reference to different approaches, and also the identification of areas and directions for extended research. In summary, for me, this is a very motivating and inspiring work. I just wanted to have, maybe this is a naive question, very natural for someone who is not deeply involved. Working functions are naturally defined under the restriction of boundary preservation. In some instances, it might be appropriate to relax this condition, maybe not for a single curve, but for comparing shapes of different curves. I understand that the general assumptions on the time-varying functions somehow allow accommodating the fact that there may exist a certain phase delay effect at the boundaries between two particular functional curves. And maybe to my knowledge, I would say accommodating at least by approximation, since invertibility is required, is a requirement. And this raises the question, formally, does the infimum in equation 7 always exist within the capital gamma space? Or maybe one can select a proper time warping invertible function with any level of approximation. I don't know if I'm
yes, yeah, absolutely. I think you raise a point that has been raised and discussed. It's an important question. So I feel like there are two questions here. The first one related to boundaries. So in this paper and in most of our work, we assume that the boundaries of functions are fixed, and we match only the internal parts, imposing the boundary conditions. And of course, in real data, there is always a possibility that even the boundaries don't match very well. And so why don't we allow also the boundaries to be matched? And so it turns out one can do that, but it adds 2 more degrees to be matched, 2 more variables to be matched. And it becomes quite cumbersome, even more cumbersome, let's say, in terms of matching. So we have done one work. It's a paper a couple of years ago in journal TPAMI, where we fix one boundary, let's say the starting point. So we can slide all the functions such that they're starting points. For example, COVID curves, the start of the COVID we can match, and we allow the last point to be flexible. And as you can imagine, what we are doing in terms of adding to our computational costs, we in principle, we allow all possible placements of the second boundary point, and then the nonlinear matching of the domain. So it became sort of a combinatorial problem, but we have a good, I think, a clever computational solution. So it's quite very well laid out math. So we have studied that, and there is a paper that follows up on that. The second part of your question was actual existence of the minimizer for that optimization. It's a very central to everything we do is this matching and the. So it turns out if one has some assumptions about the functions that we are comparing. So for example, if one of them is piecewise linear, or if or both of them have some kind of smoothness like C1 continuity, then there exists a solution, and we can reach it. We can construct it. We have algorithms to exactly construct it. It may not be unique. As you can imagine, you're trying to match a bimodal function with a unimodal function. If they are identical peaks, you can even pick either the left peak or the right peak. So uniqueness is not guaranteed, but just like many optimization problems, uniqueness. But as I have mathematical colleagues who are interested in even more general mathematical existence solutions, so I let them do that. And but in practical sense, I think we have a good handle on this existence issue for most of the practical cases. But of course, because these are infinite dimensional manifolds and these are nonlinear manifolds, so many questions remain from a mathematical perspective, and it's quite possible they may have bearing on the practical issues down the line. So there's a lot to be discussed there. Thank you for your question. They're very relevant.
So many thanks for the very nice response. Another issue, but simpler. I will understand that in the case of non-regular functional data curves, one can always use some kind of regularization or smoothing approaches. For instance, kernel-based, or in particular Weblet-based, for a, say, multi-scale, multi-resolution shape analysis. So, this might be formally approached under consideration of probably Sobolev spaces and fractional derivatives, as I think was suggested by Lajos Horvath in his discussion. Just a comment. I don't know if you like to say that.
Yes, absolutely. So again, there are a couple of different points here. One is about multi-resolution shape analysis. So it's very often, as a practitioner, we get data which is very complex, but we don't always want to deal with the data in full complexity. We want to be able to control the complexity and suit to our needs, and then maybe increase in complexity as we understand data more. So we are looking at, for more complex objects like graphs and trees and surfaces, how to scale them in representation, sort of wavelet type ideas. The framework is going to be very similar to what you mentioned as wavelets, but using shape metrics.
Okay.
And so how to develop kernel methods for shape metrics, and do the kernels have all the nice mathematical properties on these nonlinear manifolds? So there are several questions that come up. So absolutely. I think there's work to be done, and I think I forget the second part of the question. This related to the multi-resolution.
Yeah, that's Sobolev spaces and fractional derivatives.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, and so in some sense, we are using them. I think there is more scope for that. I should mention there is a larger literature in mathematical shape analysis where people write more general metrics, which involves all the first n derivatives of the function. So we are using one, and people have shown that if you use 2, 3, and so on, the more derivatives we take, the more invariant we get to certain transformations. So that's a good mathematical direction. You get nicer and nicer properties. But of course, in practice, even dealing with second derivatives like curvatures along the functions, it's hard to estimate these things from discrete data. It gets noisier and noisier. So smoothing issues come in. So it's a balance between practicality and nice mathematical properties you get by taking more derivatives. But the literature exists, and there is a nice sort of mathematical direction to pursue these solo metrics, even the fractional metrics. Thank you.
Oh, thank you again. Thanks. Okay.
Thank you, José Miguel and Anuj. I think we have no more time for comment or question. We have no question in the chat, so only the former president of the SEIO, Spanish Society of Statistics, give the thanks a lot to the participant and the organizer for the seminar. And I think we can finish by giving again the thanks to all of you for Professor Anuj Srivastava and colleagues for this really interesting paper, and you, the discussant, for your comment. I think this paper highlights the need to consider the shape of functional data in statistical analysis and to continue advancing in the theoretical study. So, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.